All right, behind me I have the Pyxis 12K by Blackmagic Design and the Komodo X, and they are probably two of, I think, the best owner-op cameras out there right now on the market. And I think these two cameras are suited for very similar workflows and productions. So I think it's worth comparing these two cameras. I did a Pyxis 6K versus Komodo X video, and it did really well. And I also thought that those were two great cameras to compare, but the Pyxis 12K, even more so now than the Komodo X. I think those are more in line with each other. So a little bit of background. I have had the Komodo X since it was released in 2023. So I certainly have more miles on the Komodo X than I do with the Pyxis 12K, being much newer. But I've been running Blackmagic cameras for over a decade now, and so I'm no stranger to the camera system. And I also own the Ursa Cine 12K LF that I'm filming on right now, that shares the same sensor as the Pyxis 12K. So I do have working experience with this sensor as well. And big shout out to B&H for loaning out the Pyxis 12K for this video. So yeah, huge shout out to B&H for sending it out. I'll leave links down in the description below if you're interested in picking any of this up. Now, it's so hard to compare two different cameras and compare every aspect of the cameras without the video being over an hour long. So so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cover what I would want to see and what I think most people are really curious to know about. So let's go ahead and start off with the sensors. The Komodo X has a 6K 17:9 Super 35 global shutter sensor, whereas the Pyxis 12K has a full frame 12K RGBW 3x2 rolling shutter sensor that actually has a little trick up its sleeve, and it can record in 12K, 8K, or 4K without cropping in on the sensor. Now, when it comes to lens mounts, both cameras have different lens mount options. The Komodo X offers a locking Canon RF mount or a locking Nikon Z mount, at least at the time of recording this. The Pyxis 12K, on the other hand, just like the Pyxis 6K, has an L mount, a locking EF mount, or a PL mount. And the lens mounts are not user interchangeable on either camera, so you really have to decide what lens mount you want for each camera. All right, moving on to physical design. Both cameras are a box style design with multiple mounting points all around, which is great for rigging. And both, and especially for like putting cages on, I would say is what most people do. And there are a ton of cage options for both cameras to really rig it out exactly how you see fit. Moving on, both cameras have built-in monitors and controls on the camera, but they are in different places. So on the Komodo X, you have a little 3x3 monitor on the top of the camera with most of the controls on the top of the camera, with the exception of the record button that is on the front and the side of the camera, as well as a power switch on the side of the camera. On the Pyxis 12K, the buttons and the monitor placement are exactly the same as the Pyxis 6K. So on the operator side is where you're going to find all of the buttons as well as the onboard monitor, and then the power switch is going to be on the rear of the camera at the very top. Now, when it comes to powering the cameras, both can be powered via DC input if you're using a power distro box or a mains power or something like that, but they both also can be powered with battery power, and they both have integrated battery mounts. So the Pyxis 12K has a BPU style battery receiver, and the Komodo X has an integrated micro V-mount battery plate. Moving on to media, both cameras take the same media, which is really cool, and that is CF Express Type B. The Komodo X has one media slot, and the Pyxis 12K has two media slots for CF Express B, but the Pyxis 12K can also record to an SSD via the USB-C port on the back of the camera, which is pretty handy to have, especially if you're in a situation like this where the camera's not really moving around. All right, moving on to some of the I/O stuff. When it comes to external monitoring, both cameras have a single 12G SDI port, which can send a 4K 60p signal. Both cameras also have dedicated monitoring ports, which is awesome. The Komodo X has a video out terminal on the front of the camera with the little pogo pins, and that can send a video signal out as well as power to the DSMC3 monitor or their EVF, which is really cool. There's also a USB-C on the back of the camera that you can plug into an iPhone or Android or a supported tablet and actually monitor that way using the RED Control app. The Pyxis 12K, on the other end, has two USB-C video out terminals. So on the front, it's the same as the Pyxis 6K. You've got that video out terminal that can send it out to like the Pyxis monitor or the Ursa EVF, the newer EVF, which is really cool. But on the back of the camera, the USB port on the back can also do the same exact thing, which is really cool. So you can actually run the viewfinder and the Pyxis monitor together, which is pretty awesome, and that EVF is so nice. So one thing that's unique about the Pyxis is it has a built-in Ethernet port, which allows you to connect the camera to cloud, or what actually I've used it on the Pyxis 6K, which is not a 10 gigabit Ethernet port, but you can actually plug it up to your computer and offload footage that way. Or what I've done is I've plugged it into my network switch, which is 10 gigabit Ethernet, to offload footage that way. Now, it's not going to be as fast as like a dedicated CF Express Type B reader, especially the version 4 or whatever readers. Those offload pretty quick. But if for some reason your card is not mounting, that is a really nice option to have. Now, one thing that from an I/O perspective that the Komodo X has that the Pyxis 12K does not have is its EXT port. Now, this EXT port gives you a lot of functionality with one port, and what you can actually do is you can get a breakout box. Like I have one from Wooden Camera. Mutiny also makes a really great one. And what you can do is you can break out the EXT functions into their individual ports, so you can get stuff like timecode, genlock, run stop with a 3-pin Fisher, so you can actually send power out to like an EVF or something like that. And then the other, like camera control. So if you don't have the DSMC3 monitor, but you have like a small HD monitor with camera control, you can break that whole, the whole idea is you can break that EXT port out into a bunch of different functions if you want to. But a lot of people, if you don't have the EXT port, you can still use it as a dedicated timecode port with the proper camera. And that's a good segue into timecode. Unsurprisingly, both cameras do support timecode in, which is really important. The Pyxis 12K has a dedicated BNC timecode port, which I personally like. I think it's definitely more of an industry standard than what's on the Komodo X without a breakout box. And you can actually use like a 3.5 millimeter to, I think it's 9-pin EXT to support timecode. But just word of warning, if you have the Komodo X and you have a sound op that's going to be on the job, do yourself a favor and just have some timecode cables ready to go, because chances are that sound op probably won't have that EXT to 3.5 millimeter cable. Moving right along to audio, both cameras support multi-track audio recording, which is awesome. The Komodo X can do up to 4 channels of audio. 2 of the channels though are the internal mics, and the other 2 are from the 5-pin audio port that actually can supply phantom power, which is awesome. And the preamps sound really good on the Komodo X and the Pyxis 12K. Now, the Pyxis 12K can do 2 channels of audio recording, and it does have internal mics like the Komodo X for scratch audio, but you kind of have to choose which ports you're going to use. You don't get 4-channel, which is kind of a bummer. But that said, the Pyxis 12K does have a mini XLR port on the front of the camera, which can supply phantom power, and a 3.5 millimeter mic input on the back of the camera, which obviously does not provide phantom power. Now, I have a breakout box for both cameras, both by Mid49, and what that does is just gives you 2 full-size XLR ports instead of the different ports on the camera. It's definitely much more important on the Komodo X, because a 5-pin audio cable is not something that you're going to be able to find in a pinch, whereas a mini XLR you probably could find a lot easier. So I just prefer the Mid49 breakout boxes. They're really great. And just one thing to note is on the Pyxis 12K and 6K for that matter, the only channel, I think it's input 1, can provide phantom power, because that's the one that's plugged up to the mini XLR port. So anyways, moving on to codecs. Both cameras record in internal RAW video, which is really great. The Komodo X in RED Code RAW and Blackmagic in the Blackmagic RAW format. Both are fantastic formats to both edit, capture, and grade. RED Code RAW has definitely been around much longer than B-RAW, and native support for that codec in most of the editing software is a little bit smoother than Blackmagic RAW. The Komodo X can record in ProRes as well, whereas the Pyxis only records in Blackmagic RAW, with the exception of the HD proxies that are in, I think, H.264 format, which is another difference. The Komodo X cannot actually record proxies in camera. So if you do a lot of remote workflows and you're uploading a lot of footage to, any other server or whatever for an editor working on proxies, that is definitely something to consider in your workflow. All right, let's move on to exposure tools. Both cameras have really great exposure tools. My favorite being false color. They also have zebras, which is also nice. And they also both have a histogram, but I don't really use the histogram on either. However, attached to the histogram are these little clipping indicators or traffic lights. And the Pyxis has this only for the highlights, whereas the Komodo X and all the other RED cameras for that matter has it for highlights and shadows, and actually has these little goalposts that show you the level of clipping and how much of the sensor of that particular channel is clipping. All right, now moving right along to sensor formats. This is where things get super interesting. Now they have like very similar formats that they share, like 16:9, 17:9, 240:1, and their full sensor formats like 12K or 6K on the Komodo X. But there are some very notable differences between the two, and frankly, I think this is where the Pyxis really outshines the Komodo X. So the Komodo X, being a 17:9 Bayer sensor, means that the most sensor you are going to record, so its open gate format, if you will, is Super 35, 6K, 17:9. And when you record at different resolutions, the image is cropped, so 5K, 4K, 2K, all that crops in on the sensor. The Pyxis 12K, on the other hand, has a 3x2 sensor, and it's also their new RGBW sensor. Well, not new. They actually had it on their Ursa Mini Pro 12K, which was a Super 35mm camera. But what's cool about this sensor is the way that they're able to scale it is when you switch to different resolutions, you don't crop in on the sensor like you do on RED cameras or most other cameras out there for that matter. And that's really cool because not only are you able to still have the full frame of the sensor without no cropping, what actually happens is the readout speed actually becomes much faster and you get higher frame rates as a result. But it's not all sunshine and rainbows. There is a compromise, and that compromise is a little less dynamic range than you get in 12K. But if you do want to crop in on the sensor, which there is a Super 35 mode, which is 9K resolution, you actually get the same dynamic range as you do in 12K and actually get a little bit improved rolling shutter performance than you do over the 12K, which makes sense to me. And being a 3x2 sensor, you can record in 3x2 open gate, which is really cool. So it's much more similar to a stills camera where the whole sensor is being recorded, and that's really great. That's super beneficial for not only anamorphic shooting, but for when you're need to shoot a project and the client is expecting or you are anticipating a vertical format out of that project as well. That just gives you more height on the sensor. So lots of benefits to shooting in 3x2 open gate. All right, moving right along to frame rates. I have this chart here, which hopefully this is helpful for the Pyxis 12K. And honestly, for most people, I would suggest focusing on the 8K and 4K frame rates, as I see this camera really as an 8K camera for most people, and shooting in 12K when you absolutely need the extra resolution or extra dynamic range. And when compared to the Komodo X, you can see that in 9K resolution and in 12K resolution, the Komodo X outperforms the Pyxis 12K, but in 8K and 4K formats, the Pyxis 12K actually edges out over the Komodo X. Now, one thing that the Komodo X is always going to perform better in is in the rolling shutter department, and that is due to the fact that the Komodo X has a global shutter sensor. And this is especially a win when it comes to the Pyxis 12K in 12K resolution, open gate, and 17:9. But when switching to 8K and 4K modes on the Pyxis, the rolling shutter is much improved. Now, for reference, the RED Raptor, which has phenomenal rolling shutter performance for an 8K full frame camera, has a readout speed of 8 milliseconds in 8K 17:9, and the Pyxis 12K in the same format is 10.89 milliseconds, which is exceptional for a camera at this price point. And honestly, anything under like 13 milliseconds is perfectly usable for pretty much every situation out there. All right, on to image quality. Took a while to get here, but we did it. Great job. Image quality is a subjective topic for sure, but I would say what is objectively true, and hopefully you can see this from the footage that I'm overlaying, is both cameras have fantastic image quality, and both cameras have, I mean, honestly, all cameras nowadays have really great image quality. But that said, let's dive into some specifics when it comes to image quality and just some of the nuances between the two cameras. So first up, colors and skin tones. Both cameras can record in RAW, so colors are pretty easy to manipulate in post, but I wanted to at least share a side-by-side of skin tones and colors to show you the way they look with a simple color space transform. Both set at the same color temperature, everything, it's literally just a color space transform. But again, being RAW, it's pretty easy to manipulate the colors, and it's really easy to match both of these cameras as well. All right, moving on to low light. In my Pyxis 6K versus Komodo X video, I noted how great the Komodo X is in low light, and I still feel the same way. It's still really good in low light. I just really thought the KX blew the Pyxis 6K out of the water when it came to low light and noise, but that is not the case with the Pyxis 12K. So I ran a similar test to my other video, and in my opinion, I think the results are very similar, both in 12K and 8K, when compared to the Komodo X with the speed booster. The extra resolution is probably a factor here with the noise, but the sensor is honestly, it's just so much cleaner than the Pyxis 6K outright. So I'm really finding that from a noise perspective, it's a very similar looking image to the Komodo X. So for me, if I were doing a shoot and I knew there were some low light scenes, it wouldn't come down to low light performance when compared to for noise on the Pyxis 12K and the Komodo X. Now, one thing I did notice in these tests though, is it seems that there's a little more saturation and maybe color information in the shadows on the Komodo X. And both clips just had a color space transform applied, so you know there's definitely more that you can do on the Pyxis 12K, but that could just be the color space transform. But I did notice that there was a little bit more color information in the shadows as compared to the Pyxis 12K, and that was like kind of me like pixel peeping and like really looking through the scene, like, you know, every corner. But like here's a comparison where I shot in a literal dungeon with very little light. It's a museum. It's not like a active dungeon. That'd be super weird. But as you can see, both cameras, they look really similar, and honestly, I think they both look really good. And actually the A camera on here was the Ursa Cine 12K, but I've done a test with the Ursa and the Pyxis, and they look identical in low light as well. So I just figured I should probably throw that out there for you. So when it comes to low light, I think both cameras perform really well. I think the main difference I'm seeing here is, like I said, a little bit of that saturation in the shadows, and that might be something that you like or something that you don't necessarily like. So I'm just putting the information out there as to what I found. Now, moving on to dynamic range, I don't think the Komodo X gets enough credit for how much dynamic range that camera has. It's really good. And like when I did the test between the Komodo X and the Pyxis 6K, honestly, like couldn't tell that much of a difference. And that's really saying something, because it's a global shutter. Like global shutter sensors historically have not been as strong as their rolling shutter counterparts. Now, I mentioned the Pyxis 6K. The Pyxis 12K, on the other hand, definitely edges out the Komodo X in the dynamic range department. So in this example, you can see The highlights definitely clip earlier on the Komodo X than on the 12K. Now this scene is honestly tough for any camera, but the Komodo X is definitely clipping, and on the Pyxis 12K there is no clipping in those highlights. And I would say that the shadow detail in that scene, the way I graded the shot was just to kind of give a pretty natural look. So like that chair on the right looks like it's completely lost, but all the details actually there. And if I actually take the grade off of both cameras, you can see what I'm talking about. There's plenty of detail there in the shadows, but definitely the highlights are definitely clipped. And this is a type of scene where, you know, I would just rate the camera at 800 ISO on both cameras, because that is definitely a good balance of highlight and shadow details. Like I said, this is a really tough scene for any camera. Now, Blackmagic states the Pyxis 12K at 12K has 16 stops of dynamic range, as well as a 9K resolution, and 15.7 stops in 8K and 4K. So if highlights are what you're protecting in 8K and 4K, you just want to make sure that you rate the ISO one stop higher than you would in 12K to have that same allocation of information in the highlights. But all that to say, I'm going to say that the from the dynamic range department, this one definitely goes to the Pyxis 12K. But in like normal lit scenarios where you have control over the scene, you're really not going to notice a difference in the scene. And like in this shot right here, like I don't really see that much of a difference between the dynamic range in the two cameras. They both look really good in my opinion. And another example where we had control over the lighting and everything, both cameras look really good, and I wouldn't say that either camera's dynamic range looks better or worse in this scenario. So wow, we did it. I hope that was helpful. And bravo to you if you are still here, or maybe bravo to me. I don't know. Anyways, I think these are, like I said, two of the best owner-op cameras out there on the market today. And at the end of the day, honestly, it just really depends on your preference of camera systems and workflow. Like, do you want full frame 12K or 8K open gate recording with really good frame rates? Or do you want a 6K Super 35mm camera with RED Code RAW? And like, it just depends on the productions. Like if you're working in a lot of productions where RED cameras are really prevalent, or a market where RED camera packages are rented out a lot, then maybe RED's the move for you. But if not, if you are like just an owner op or you run your own production company, I honestly think the Blackmagic Pyxis 12K is something that you definitely should take a very serious look at. Well, hey, thanks for watching this video. I'm gonna wrap this up because this video is probably like 9 hours long. And if you like have made it this far and you still have like nothing to add in the comment section, but you're like just itching to comment something, tell me what your favorite American football team is, NFL or college, I don't care. Just let me know down in the comments. See you in the next one. Peace.